The saloon doors of Redemption Creek swung lazily in the desert wind, their hinges groaning like old bones. Inside, the air hung thick with tobacco smoke and the bitter scent of regret. At the far end of the bar, towering above every soul in the establishment, stood Magnus Mac McCready, 6 feet 8 inches of weathered leather and broken dreams. His massive hands dwarfed the gliscast as he stared into its amber depths, searching for answers that never came. The other patrons gave him a wide berth, not out of fear, but out of respect for a man's private hell. Mac had been drinking steadily for 3 days, ever since the telegram arrived from back east. The saloon's bat-wing doors creaked open, and a small figure slipped inside. A girl no more than 10 years old, with dirt-streaked cheeks and eyes that held too much wisdom for her tender years. She wore a faded calico dress and boots too big for her feet, hand-me-downs from a world that had forgotten her. "Mister," she said, her voice cutting through the smoky haze like a church bell on Sunday morning. Mac didn't turn around. "This ain't no place for children, little one. Best you run 'long home." "Don't have a home to run to," she replied matter-of-factly, climbing onto the stool beside him. The bartender, a grizzled man named Silas, started to protest, but something in the child's demeanor stopped him cold. Mac finally looked down at her, his steel-gray eyes meeting her unwavering gaze. "What's your name, child?" "Hope," she said simply. "Hope Cartwright. And you're drinking yourself to death, ain't you, Mr. McCready?" The giant cowboy's hand froze halfway to his lips. "How do you know my name?" "Everybody knows your name. You're the man who used to smile, the one who helped Mrs. Patterson when her roof caved in last winter, the one who gave Jimmy Thornton a job when his pa died in a mine collapse." She paused, studying his face with those ancient eyes. But that was before the letter came. Mac set down his glass with trembling fingers. "You don't know nothing about that letter, child." "I know it made you stop being the man you were," Hope said quietly. "I know it made you think whiskey could wash away whatever's eating at your insides. But you don't drink whiskey, Mr. McCready. Not really. You never did before." The saloon had grown quiet around them, the usual chatter dying away as patrons strained to hear this strange conversation between the giant and the child. "And what would you know about drinking, little Hope?" Mac's voice carried a bitter edge. "I know my daddy drank his pride away, drop by drop, until there wasn't nothing left of him but an empty bottle and a broken promise." Her small hand reached out and touched his massive forearm. "And I know you shouldn't drink his pride either." Mac's breath caught in his throat. The letter, crumpled now and stained with whiskey, lay in his vest pocket like a lead weight against his heart. News from Philadelphia. News about his brother Thomas, the successful lawyer, the golden child who had everything Mac had ever wanted. Thomas, who had written to gloat about his latest triumph, his newest acquisition, his perfect life in the civilized East. "You don't understand," Mac whispered, his voice breaking like autumn leaves. "Some men are born to greatness, and others are born to watch from the shadows." Hope slid off her stool and stood before him, barely reaching his belt buckle. "My mama used to say that a man's worth ain't measured by what he's got, but by what he gives. And you, Mr. McCready, you given this town more than any fancy lawyer ever could." The child's words hit him like a physical blow. Mac looked around the saloon. at Silas, who had extended him credit when times were lean, at old Pete, whose life Mac had saved during a flash flood, at the working girls who knew they could count on his protection when the rougher elements came to town. "The letter," Mac said, pulling the crumpled paper from his pocket. "It's from my brother. He's bought the ranch, the family ranch back in Pennsylvania, the one our daddy promised would be mine someday." Hope took the letter with small, careful hands and smoothed it out on the bar. She couldn't read the fancy script, but she didn't need to. The pain in Mac's voice told her everything she needed to know. "So he took something that was yours," she said. "That don't make him bigger than you, that just makes him smaller." Mac stared at this strange, wise child who had appeared in his darkest hour like an angel in calico. "Where did you come from, Hope Cartwright?" "From the same place we all come from hurt and hope and the need to find something worth believing in." As the sun began to set outside the saloon windows, painting the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson, Mac McCready made a decision that would change everything. He pushed the whiskey glass away, its contents untouched for the first time in 3 days. "You're right, little one," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I don't drink whiskey, and I sure as hell won't drink his pride." But as the evening shadows lengthened, neither Mac nor Hope could have known that Thomas McCready was already on a train heading west, carrying with him a proposition that would test every principle the giant cowboy held dear. 3 weeks had passed since Hope Cartwright had spoken those words that pulled Mac McCready back from the brink of self-destruction. The giant cowboy had thrown himself into his work with renewed vigor, helping to rebuild the schoolhouse that had been damaged in the last storm, and organizing the town's defense against the increasing bandit raids that plagued the territory. Hope had become his shadow, appearing at his side with the persistence of morning sunlight. She slept in the stable behind the saloon, earning her keep by tending to the horses and running errands for the townspeople. Mac had tried to find her proper lodging, but the child seemed to prefer the independence of her makeshift home among the hay bales and saddle leather. It was on a Tuesday morning, when the desert air still held the cool promise of dawn, that the stagecoach arrived with a passenger who would shatter the fragile peace Mac had built around his wounded heart. Thomas McCready stepped down from the coach with the calculated grace of a man accustomed to making entrances. Where Mac was built like a mountain, broad, solid, and weathered by the elements, Thomas was carved from marble, all sharp angles and polished surfaces. His tailored suit was immaculate despite the dusty journey, and his pale hands had never known the honest calluses of hard work. "Hello, brother," he said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of Eastern education. "You're looking rustic." Mac stood in the middle of Main Street, his massive frame casting a long shadow in the morning sun. Around them the townspeople had gathered, sensing the electricity in the air that comes before a storm. "Thomas," Mac said, his voice steady, controlled, "didn't expect to see you this far from civilization." "Oh, but this is exactly where civilization is heading, Magnus," Thomas smiled, but it was the smile of a predator sizing up his prey. "The railroad is coming through this territory within the year. Do you know what that means?" Hope appeared at his side, her small hand slipping into his massive one. Thomas's gaze fell upon her with the casual dismissal of a man who had never learned to see value in anything that couldn't be bought or sold. "It means," Thomas continued, "that this little patch of desert is about to become very valuable indeed,
which is why I'm here with a proposition." "I ain't interested in your propositions," Mac said, but Thomas raised a manicured hand. "Hear me out, brother. I've done my research. This town sits on the perfect route for the railroad's western expansion. The company is prepared to pay handsomely for the right-of-way, but they need someone with local influence to smooth the negotiations." Thomas's smile widened. "Someone like you." "And what's in it for you?" Mac asked, though he already knew the answer. "Partnership, Magnus. 50-50 split on everything. The railroad money, the land speculation, the business opportunities that will follow. We could be rich men, brother, richer than our father ever dreamed." The crowd had grown larger, and Mac could feel their...
Thomas reached into his jacket and withdrew a thick envelope. $10,000, Magnus. Cash. Your share of the advance payment, just for agreeing to help facilitate the negotiations. Think about what you could do with that money. The envelope seemed to glow in the morning sunlight, and Mac could hear the sharp intake of breath from the gathered townspeople. $10,000 was more money than most of them would see in a lifetime. "Take it," whispered old Pete from the crowd. "Lord knows you've earned it, Mac." "Think of what good you could do," added Mrs. Patterson. "The school needs repairs. The church needs a new roof." But Hope's hand tightened in his, and when Mac looked down at her, he saw something that made his heart ache. Fear. Not fear of poverty or hardship, but fear of losing the one person who had shown her that there were still good men in the world. "You know what your problem is, Thomas," Mac said, his voice carrying across the silent street. "You think everything has a price. You think every man can be bought, every principle can be negotiated away for the right amount of coin." "Can't they?" Thomas asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "Name me one thing that money can't buy, Magnus." Mac looked around at the faces surrounding him. Silas from the saloon, who had given him credit when he was down to his last dollar. Dr. Morrison, who had never charged a fee he couldn't afford. The working girls from the saloon, who had sewn a new dress for Hope from their own meager earnings. "Respect," Mac said finally. "You can't buy respect, Thomas. You can buy fear, you can buy obedience, you can even buy the appearance of admiration, but respect, that's something a man has to earn." Thomas's smile faltered for the first time. "And you think these people respect you? They're using you, Magnus. They see a big, strong fool who'll do their dirty work for free, and they're laughing behind your back." "Maybe they are," Mac admitted, "but I'd rather be a fool who stands for something than a rich man who stands for nothing." The envelope hit the dust at Mac's feet, and Thomas's mask of civility finally slipped away entirely. "You are always too stupid to know what was good for you," he snarled. "But this railroad is coming through whether you help or not, and when it does, I'll make sure you don't see a penny of the profits." "Then I guess we'll just have to find another way," Mac said calmly. As the Thomas climbed back into the stagecoach, his parting words carried the weight of a curse. "You'll regret this, Magnus. Mark my words, you'll regret this." But as the coach disappeared in a cloud of dust, Mac felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the quiet satisfaction of a man who had chosen principle over profit. Hope squeezed his hand, and in that simple gesture he found all the wealth he would ever need. What neither of them knew was that Thomas McCready was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully, and his next move would threaten everything Mac held dear. The attack came at dawn, 3 days after Thomas McCready's departure.
Mac was in the stable, helping Hope tend to a mare that had gone lame when the thunder of hoofbeats shattered the morning calm. Through the stable doors they watched as a dozen riders swept into town like a plague of locusts, their faces hidden behind bandanas, their guns already drawn. "Bandits!" Hope whispered, but Mac's experienced eye caught details that made his blood cold. The riders moved with military precision. Their horses were too well fed for common outlaws, and their weapons were newer than anything the local desperados could afford. "No," Mac said grimly, "these ain't bandits." The riders spread out through the town with practiced efficiency, herding the terrified townspeople into the street at gunpoint. Mac counted them quickly. 12 men, all armed, all moving like soldiers following orders. At their head rode a man Mac recognized from wanted posters, Jake the Scorpion Morrison, a gun for hire who sold his services to the highest bidder. "Well, well," Morrison called out, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of a man who enjoyed his work. "If it ain't the famous Magnus McCready, heard you turned down a mighty generous offer recently." Mac stepped out of the stable, his hands held carefully away from his gun. Hope tried to follow, but he pushed her back with a gentle but firm hand. "Stay hidden," he whispered. "No matter what happens, you stay hidden." "That's right, Morrison," Mac said, walking slowly toward the center of town. "I turned it down. What's it to you?" Morrison laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, it's everything to me, big man. You see, I got a new employer, real generous fella, pays top dollar for quality work. And he's got a particular interest in this little town of yours." The pieces fell into place in Mac's mind with sickening clarity. Thomas hadn't accepted defeat. He had simply changed tactics. If he couldn't buy Mac's cooperation, he would eliminate the need for it entirely. "Let me guess," Mac said, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. "Your employer wants the town cleared out, make it easier for the railroad to come through without having to negotiate with stubborn locals." "Smart man," Morrison said, dismounting from his horse with fluid grace. "Though not smart enough, it seems. Could have taken the money and walked away rich. Instead, you chose to be a hero." He spat in the dust. "Heroes die poor, Creedy." Around them, the townspeople huddled together in terrified silence. Mac could see old Pete clutching his chest, his weak heart struggling with the stress. Mrs. Patterson held her young son close, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Dr. Morrison, no relation to the gunfighter, stood protectively in front of his medical bag, knowing that his skills might be needed before this day was done. "So what's the play here, Morrison?" Mac asked. "You planning to gun down the whole town? That's a lot of witnesses, even for you." "Oh, nothing so crude," Morrison replied with mock offense. "We're just here to deliver a message. See, there's been some unfortunate incidents lately. Bandit raids, they call them. Terrible shame how these frontier towns sometimes just disappear. People get scared, they pack up and leave, seeking their fortunes elsewhere." One of Morrison's men, a scarred brute with dead eyes, stepped forward. "Boss, why don't we just get this over with? Kill the big man and burn the town. Send a real clear message." Morrison held up his hand. "Patience, Cutter. Mr. McGrady here is a reasonable man. I'm sure he can see the wisdom in encouraging his friends to relocate somewhere safer." His cold eyes fixed on Mac. "After all, accidents happen. People get hurt. Sometimes they don't get up again." As to emphasize his point, Morrison drew his pistol with lightning speed and fired a shot that shattered the window of the general store. The townspeople screamed and scattered, but Morrison's men quickly herded them back together. That was just a demonstration, Morrison said calmly, holstering his weapon. Next time, I might not aim so high. Mike felt the familiar weight of his own gun at his hip, but he knew the mathematics of the situation. 12 against 1, with innocent lives in the crossfire. Even if he could take down Morrison and a few of his men, the others would slaughter the townspeople in revenge. "What do you want?" Mac asked through gritted teeth. "Simple," Morrison replied. "You have 24 hours to convince these good people to pack up and leave. Tomorrow at dawn, we come back. If the town's empty, we ride on. If it's not," he stretched elegantly, "and if I refuse?" Morrison's smile was the grin of a skull. "Then we start with the children, work our way up to the adults, make it real slow and educational-like." The threat hit Mike like a physical blow. His eyes swept the crowd, taking in the faces of people who would become his family. People who trusted him to protect them, to stand between them and the darkness that prowled the frontier. "You're a real piece of work, Morrison," Mac said quietly. "I'm a businessman. Nothing personal, McCready, just economics, supply and demand. Your employer brother is supplying the demand for this land, and I'm supplying the means to clear it." As Morrison and his men mounted up to leave, the gunfighter paused at the edge of town. 24 hours, McCready. Don't make this harder than it has to be." The dust cloud from their departure had barely settled when the townspeople began to argue among themselves. Some wanted to fight.
"What choice do we have?" Dr. Morrison asked. "Mac's just one man, even if he is the size of two. He can't fight 12 professional gunmen." Mac stood in the center of the arguing crowd, feeling the weight of their fear and their hope pressing down on him like a mountain. In the stable, he knew Hope was listening to every word, her young heart breaking as she watched the only home she had ever known tear itself apart. That night, as the town settled into an uneasy sleep, Mac sat alone on the porch of the saloon, staring up at the stars and trying to find an answer that didn't exist. He had faced down rustlers and claim jumpers, survived blizzards and droughts, but he had never faced anything like this. The soft sound of footsteps made him look up. Hope emerged from the shadows, her small face pale in the moonlight. "You're thinking about giving up," she said. It wasn't a question. "I'm thinking about keeping you all alive," Mac replied. "Sometimes that's the same thing." Hope climbed up onto the porch and sat beside him, her legs dangling over the edge. "My daddy used to say that a man who gives up his home gives up his soul." "Your daddy also drank himself to death," Mac pointed out gently. "Yeah, but he was right about that one thing. This town, these people, there's your soul, Mr. McCready. You give that up, and you'll be just as dead as if Morrison put a bullet in you." Mac looked down at this strange, wise child who had already seen too much of the world's cruelty. "And what if I fight and lose? What if I get everyone killed trying to be a hero?" She was quiet for a long moment, her young mind wrestling with questions that would challenge a philosopher. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then at least we'll die as ourselves. And sometimes that's the only choice that matters." As the night wore on toward dawn, Mac McCready sat on that porch and made the hardest decision of his life. By morning, he would be either a hero or a dead man,
But he would not be a coward. The final confrontation was coming, and with it a reckoning that would determine not just the fate of Redemption Creek, but the very soul of the man they called Big Mike McCready.
"You're outnumbered, Morrison," Mac said calmly. "Outgunned and outmaneuvered. Your employer didn't pay you enough to die for his greed." Morrison's remaining men looked around nervously, their earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. They were professional killers, but they were also pragmatists. A fair fight was one thing, but this was rapidly becoming a massacre. "Stand down," Morrison shouted to his man. "This isn't over, McCready." "Yes, it is," said a new voice from the edge of town. Everyone turned to see a small figure walking down the main street, Hope Cartwright, carrying something in her hands that made Morrison's blood run cold. It was a telegraph message, still damp from the operator's key. "Funny thing about telegraphs," Hope said, her young voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Messages travel real fast, faster than horses, even faster than hired guns." She held up the telegram for all to see. "This here's from the Territorial Marshal's office. Seems they got word about some men terrorizing innocent towns, making threats, trying to force people off their land. They're real interested in talking to a fella named Jake Morrison and his associates." Morrison's face went white. "You little—" "The marshal's already on his way. Should be here by noon, along with a full company of cavalry. Seems the territorial governor takes a dim view of men who threaten women and children." The sound of approaching hoofbeats confirmed her words. In the distance, a dust cloud was rising, too large to be anything but a military patrol. Morrison looked around at his trapped men, at the armed townspeople, at the approaching cavalry, and made the only rational choice available to him. "Mount up," he shouted to his men. "We're leaving." But Mac stepped into the street, blocking their path. "Not so fast, Morrison. You came here to deliver a message. Well, I've got one for you to take back to my brother." Morrison's hand hovered over his gun, but he knew he was beaten. "What message?" Mac's voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "You tell Thomas McCready that his money can't buy what these people have. You tell him that some things in this world are worth more than gold, and some men can't be bought at any price. And you tell him that if he ever threatens my family again—" Mac's eyes grew hard as flint. "I'll come looking for him personally." As Morrison and his remaining men rode out of town, their tails between their legs like whipped dogs, the townspeople of Redemption Creek erupted in cheers. But Mac barely heard them. His attention was focused on the small figure standing in the middle of the street, her face glowing with pride and relief. "How did you know the marshal was coming?" Mac asked as Hope ran to his side. "I didn't," she admitted with a grin, "but I figured Morrison didn't know that. Sometimes the best weapon you can have is the one your enemy thinks you're holding." Mac knelt down and pulled the child into a bear hug that lifted her feet off the ground. "You magnificent little schemer," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved us all." "No," Hope said, her arms wrapped tight around his neck. "We saved each other. That's what families do." As the cavalry patrol rode into town to find nothing but celebrating townspeople and a few scattered bandits fleeing into the desert, Mac McCready realized that he had found something more valuable than any railroad fortune or family inheritance. He had found his place in the world, his purpose, his home. The letter from Thomas still sat in his vest pocket, but it no longer held any power over him. Let his brother have the family ranch, the money, the empty success of a man who measured worth in dollars and cents. Mac had something Thomas would never understand and could never buy.
the respect and love of people who chose to stand with him when the chips were down. That evening, as the sun set over Redemption Creek in a blaze of gold and crimson, Mac sat on the saloon porch with Hope beside him, watching the townspeople go about their evening routines. Children played in the street, couples walked hand in hand, and the sound of laughter drifted from the open windows. "You know what I learned today?" Hope said, her voice soft in the gathering dusk. "What's that, little one?" "I learned that you don't drink whiskey, and you sure don't drink anybody's pride." He laughed, a sound like distant thunder rolling across the desert. "No, I surely don't." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Mac McCready knew that he was exactly where he belonged, not in the shadow of his brother's success, but in the light of his own choices, surrounded by people who had chosen to call him family. The railroad would come eventually, bringing change and progress and new challenges, but whatever the future held, Redemption Creek would face it together, united by the bonds forged in the crucible of that dawn confrontation. And in the stable behind the saloon, a little girl named Hope would sleep peacefully, knowing that some giants are gentle, some cowboys don't drink whiskey, and sometimes the smallest voice can speak the loudest truth. The West was still wild, still dangerous, still unforgiving, but in one small town, on one dusty street, a giant of a man had learned that the greatest victory isn't conquering your enemies. It's discovering who you really are when everything you care about is on the line.